Thank you very much indeed, those of you who are staying here. We're very conscious that this is the last session between you and a drink, but I tell you, you're going to be so energized by the conversation here that you're not going to even want to leave the hall. You're going to want to come and speak to these speakers afterwards. I've got here Alice Dietrich, I have here Jason Adkins, I have Hilary Sutcliffe, and Olivier Oullier. And we're going to have a conversation about a whole lot of the dimensions of the politics and ethics of wellness. I've been listening to these people having a conversation already, and I can tell you it's seriously energizing. The first thing I'd like to start with, really, it's just a simple question to throw out to you. How much am I meant to be in charge of my health? Or how much should the state, the nanny state, be looking after me? How much do I have choice? Do I have that choice? Alice?
Okay, thanks a lot. I think that's a very interesting question, and I think it boils down to, on the one hand, education, like how much education does a person have? I think the more education, the more a person knows, the more the person should be self-responsible. If the person has very little education, it might be good if the state takes certain responsibility. But again, I think it's a very tricky question to answer.
Well, how does the state choose whether someone's got enough education?
That's another question.
Jason, what do you think about this?
Well, as a practicing lawyer, our experience is the underside of the capitalist system is that it's quite predatory in some instances. And you need to protect people against predatory misbehavior, no matter the industry, health, wellness, food, etc. So our view is that you certainly have to have a robust regulatory regime to frame what's appropriate and acceptable. You need a market-based legal system that allows people to protect themselves if they're injured or if there's fraud or misrepresentation. And of course, you need education for the public, which needs to be independent. And that's a complex mix of things. But systems need to be responsive, and there need to be mechanisms that are self-actuating that allow consumers to be and patients to be protected, in our view.
Does that happen? I mean, you come from the United States.
I do.
I thought in the United States, the citizen was just let to get on with it. Look after your own health. We don't need it. You've got insurance, personal insurance, Obamacare. A lot of people don't even like the idea of Obamacare. So actually in that laissez-faire system, what's happening to people?
Well, the laissez-faire system in terms of wellness, by the way, we have 40 million people uninsured, which is a disaster, of course. We have a huge obesity problem. We have a food system that peddles sugar over health. And so the laissez-faire system doesn't really work. There is a legal system that brings class actions. We do class actions to enforce collective reform and change. And for example, in the food space, I've been able to change thousands of labels over the last 5 years. So there's mechanisms to keep it in check, but because it's more predatory, less so in Europe, it's more predatory, you have more of the kind of problems and consequences of a predatory capitalism. Hence the need to be more vigilant.
Hilary, you were sort of reaching for your mic.
No, I thought you were going to get me, and so I was just getting ready. Well, we're thinking about this in the UK at the moment as well, because we see a lot of individualization. You know, we need to have a choice about our own health and well-being. But on the other hand, things like big data is, you know, we actually have to have more of a social welfare collaborative model to have this really work. So these sometimes are at odds with each other, and as a society, we need to be really thinking about what we're choosing, what we're regulating, what we're incentivizing, and whether it becomes a sort of individualistic approach or whether it becomes a more collaborative social welfare approach. That will make a massive difference to actual health outcomes for people all across the world. And it's something we think that citizens themselves need to be involved in that discussion and that debate. But at the moment, it's happening by governments and businesses, and we are happening to sort of like put our hands up and think, oh no, I don't really think, and I actually agree with that, or we just say, yeah, I'll buy that, and regardless of the thought. So I think we need a more collaborative conversation about all of that.
You brought out that big data word. That's great. Olivier, what you're doing is actually collecting a massive amount of data on people's wellness. I think your new product is doing that. And who owns that data? What's happening to that data?
Well, people do own their data, and people choose to share it or not. But let me step back to the human part of it. There is something that is very politically incorrect to discuss, is personal responsibility. Because it's so easy to blame big industries, the behavior in finance, food, etc. Ultimately, it might be hard for people to think and realize that 40 years ago, we didn't know that cigarettes would cause lung cancer. Now, everybody, at least in G7 countries, has been informed one way or another that sugar can create issues, that cigarette can create issues, yet people choose to have certain consumer behavior. What is their argument? That they are free. They want to be free not to wear a helmet when they ride a bike. They want to be free to smoke because it's my problem. Well, it depends on the healthcare system you're in. If you're in a single payer where the government, hence my taxes, are going to pay for your lung cancer, then I should have a say in you smoking or not. I, as another individual, it's not just your choice. It's also a collective choice. So this illusion of ownership, of decision-making, we all want to own our health data. I do. We all want to have a say in some of the treatments we're going to take. Seriously? Do you really want to ask me, a non-physician, which cancer treatment I should prefer? No, it's you, physician, who studied 15 years and who should give me some answers. And this is the paradox. We want to have a choice, yet we're not informed, which is overall in society, and for us to feel well, the whole referendum issue. We're going to ask people who absolutely know nothing about nuclear plants, about nutrition, about anything, to give their opinion and decide for the government. And that makes no sense, but we do feel well when we're asked the question.
It actually picks up a conversation that we were having last night, which is a lot about the prevention and cure, and the economics of prevention compared to the economics of cure. The state says you should be vaccinated, and yet there's a movement against vaccination. Does that make sense? Alice?
I honestly don't think it makes sense. I think you would help far more people, you would increase overall health, and you would save a lot of money if the state and every single person would invest far more in prevention. Because there you can preempt a lot of things. You cannot preempt everything. I mean, you cannot, and we had this discussion yesterday, would then industry make less money? This is all nonsense, because there is still diseases, there's still things that come your way that you cannot prevent, but there's a lot you can prevent. You can do a certain amount of prevention.
But does the pharma industry make more money out of the products that cure than out of the vaccinations?
I wouldn't only say vaccination is prevention. There's lots of more prevention, so I would be careful with that. I think the pharma industry makes more money with treatment, but there's still enough, because when you take cancer, for example, there is very little you can do to prevent cancer. You can probably get it in earlier stages, and there you still will have to do treatment. So I think there is no good argument to not do prevention, and pharma industry actually supporting prevention, because again, they still make money.
Jason, in your laissez-faire country, there's a lot of movement against vaccination. People are saying, I don't want to be vaccinated. Why should I be vaccinated? This comes back perhaps to Olivier's ill-informed, ill-educated population claiming personal responsibility. But what do you think about that?
Well, first of all, it's a disaster, as been evidenced in certain communities. Hasidic populations tend not to trust the vaccination process. There's been outbreaks of disease in those communities. I think it's a direct evidence that vaccination works and that abstention does not. I think it's a small movement. Hopefully it'll come to a termination sooner than later. It goes to the larger question that Olivier raised, which is where does independent action run against collective need and requirement? And of course, vaccinations don't work if you're under 95% vaccination. So there's a certain requirement that the society at large achieve those collective goals. And I think that's a good paradigm for looking at other things. Food quality, healthcare objectives and criteria, data management, and so forth. What is better for the collective good and how best to get there, within the context of allowing reasonable rights and protections for the individual liberties.
Hilary, you're raising your mic.
So I'm speaking to some people doing some thinking on this anti-vax thing, because anti-vax people are rather stupid and they're clearly against society's better habits and all that sort of thing. But also you've got to look at it from a very rational point of view. Anti-vax is quite a rational point of view, funnily enough. Because what happened initially when the initial problems arose, people went to their doctors, particularly in the States, and the doctors didn't have time for them. And because the doctors didn't have time to read the papers so much, they were a bit uncomfortable with the advice they were giving. So the people they trusted couldn't really give them the advice. So they went away and they talked to other people and they talked to their friends and they talked to people and they read things in the newspapers that talked about the link between autism and vaccination. And they saw people in the communities that happening at the same time. And then they read all about how, distrusting, how they shouldn't be trusting these businesses, these big pharmaceutical companies. And they add in these two and two and these things added and added to a real distrust. But instead of being empathetic and respectful in the way that they were addressed and their concerns were addressed, a lot of the time they were treated by experts with disrespect and disdain and as if they were utterly stupid. And that reinforced their opinion that actually, the government is really trying to do something to us here because look the way they're treating me in this disrespectful way. So, it's not quite as straightforward as that, but there is a whole culture and process behind that led people to make to them a rational and thoughtful decision.
There is a very simple behavioral principle. You cannot be convinced or influenced by something or someone you never heard of. And that is a question of responsibility from the media, from public people like us, or speaking in public, addressing topics like anti-vax, anti-climate, change, and giving these people airtime. At some point, choice needs to be made. If we trust the data, meaning that 97% of the scientific literature shows that climate change exists, and the 3% that are anti-climate are not backed up by science, at the very best, those people should have 3% of airtime in media, not equal time in a debate. And this is where exerting the right to silence is very, very important. First, because, as I mentioned, you cannot convince people if the ideas don't spread, number one. Number two, in order to feel despised, not considered, well, you need the conversation to happen. If a conversation does not happen, sure, there will be conspiracy theorists that are going to say, we're hiding things from us. But again, it's because you give equal airtime to anti-vax and vax in a debate that these ideas spread. And I think the right to silence needs to become a duty of silence from time to time. And this extends for the wellness of healthcare-related issues, environmental issues, but also anti-terror issues. Think about the fact that we never talk about the victims, but we see the terrorists on front pages of the newspapers.
I've got a couple of Alice, come on, you were agitating there.
No, I can only agree with what you're saying, because the big problem that we have is when science is misrepresented and data are wrongly put in the media, we have huge problems because they are totally, it's just misrepresentation. And we in pharma industry, we are constantly bashed for, we cannot do this, we cannot do that. We have to be extremely careful to represent everything neutrally, stay absolutely on the science and where it is. And then media comes in and something like the anti-vaccination campaign starts with, I think, one publication that one person put out there based on very little data. And this is exactly what happens, and it happens everywhere. Things are getting exaggerated based on nothing. And I think there also should, when we talk about data, it should be real data and not data that are exploited in the wrong way, because it just make a good story.
Jason, are you agreeing or disagreeing here?
I think what you said is exactly right. I'd just pick up on the climate change as a model for the discussion about why the 3% tends to get a larger voice in the vaccine debate or the climate change debate. Sometimes it's a minority of people misusing data that then accelerates from conspiracy theory. But often what happens, for example, in the fossil fuel industry is that you have massive forces, economic forces, that do everything they can to distort the debate. They finance and put out, like tobacco did for many years, misinformation about what's going on. You see it in tobacco, you see it in healthcare, you see it in climate change, you see it across the board. That distorts the public debate, it distorts the policy. And of course, if you follow the policy where the money flows, that is corporations funding campaigns and candidates that support this distortive mentality or not willing to act on behalf of the common good, then you're going to have this massive distortion, which is rampant across every industry right now. So I think our climate change and the 3% is a perfect example of that.
Sounds like a certain amount of sort of radical agreement there. Can I
think?
Can I, which worries me, can I pick up a different thing? You said 3%. Can I take another percentage and play that one, going in a different tack? There's a lot of talk about the 1% and the 99%. In modern healthcare, what are the economics of modern healthcare? Is that 1% going to be the perfectly healthy group of people and the 99% is going to be left out? Or is there some kind of balance? Can the 1% fund the 99%? Are there mechanisms for doing that? Or are we actually going into a place where there is even greater inequality because we're talking about people living longer, CRISPR available for the 1% but not available for the 99%? Where are we going on that? Anyone going to pick up?
Well, it's my turn. It's called the National Health Service, actually, Piers. But, I mean, I'm just I disappointingly agree with these guys. This idea of false balance is really corrosive. And actually, I think it's the same here in terms of these sorts of things. We have to polarize everything, but it's not polarizable. It's all incredibly nuanced, incredibly sort of made up of a number of complex issues. So what I think we need to do is learn from the anti-vax sort of approach, which is we need to communicate and engage in a much more compelling and useful and interesting way about the right things that we really want to have happen, instead of let them take all of the high ground.
Fear spreads, fear sells. And there is a culture of putting on the front page, again, the terrorists rather than the victims. And this is a matter of choice. The one thing I would like to say is I am a scientist. And as a scientist, I'm highly biased. And I'm just giving my very biased view and interpretation of data. I admit it. One of the problems is there are a lot of corporations out there that are claiming that they're neutral, that they're objective. Neutrality and objectivity do not exist. And if media, they have a right to give airtime to climate deniers, to anti-vax, but they also not only have a right, but the duty to admit that they are biased. And this is not a problem. Being biased is being human. Biases are like gravity. You can deny them, but they're always there.
Great expression. I want to change tack a little bit. I'm conscious we don't have a lot of time, but there's an awful lot more we could go. And I think this one we've talked well about. Olivier, Hilary, you, I know, both of you have been advisors on bioethics to governments. Can I just ask you, what are the really big challenges and issues in bioethics nowadays that you're trying to wrap your and the collective awareness and policy process around?
I mean, a lot of it is quite futuristic. So this concept of human enhancement, when it is something, you know, people I know speak of biohybrid humans, and a biohybrid human is a person with an artificial leg. It's not a biohybrid human. That is a person who is taking advantage of technology to make themselves more mobile. So again, what we're looking at is when is that threshold, that red line between medical and human enhancement areas, and what do we do about that as a society?
You and I are enhanced by the oldest human-machine interface.
Absolutely. I'm on HRT, I tell you,
Exactly.
I am so enhanced, I can't even begin to tell you.
Number two, back to your point, I think one of the main issues is data sharing, personal data sharing. We're in this paradox where people are very happy to share personal pictures on social media, but are reluctant to share their blood type on a government website or database. For reasons that are, economists would say, non-rational, whatever that means, meaning that economists can't explain it with their unrealistic models, generally. But what the point is there is not only a right, but a duty to share your data, especially if you got a state, a government, that is paying for research and that would pay for your cancer treatment. I would feel it a duty as a citizen to share my data so that R&D that works on leveraging AI and precision medicine to fix cancer would move forward and improve. That would be my contribution to public good. And this is something that is very, very hard for people to understand because once again, there is this whole narrative about AI, whatever that means, taking jobs, automation being a threat for the future of work, but we are able to contain cancers that people were dying of less than 5 years ago. And the only reason this is happening is generally, number one, because there is public research, but because there is at least fundamental and private research and go-to-market strategies that come from the pharma industry. Like it or not, a lot of people would be dead without the pharma industry. And finally, it's because people have been sharing data. If we all keep our data and we don't share data, we would not contribute to the public good and to improve healthcare and healthcare delivery.
Let's go to the pharma industry.
Let's go to the pharma industry. Yeah, and I fully agree with you. And the thing is, what people do not understand, that 75% of research is actually funded and conducted by pharma industry. It's very, very little that actually comes out of academia. And very few people know that. But going back to data sharing, I think this is one of the key things that is very, very little known, that people really should be sharing their data. And the same for hospitals. Hospitals have huge databases that they lock in there. We have to buy for a lot of money. Sometimes you only get pieces and bits of it, and they're all out there. And we share our data on our little, whatever you call that, you know, the watches and stuff like that. If you would be able to share all of that, we could improve a lot. We could probably get medicines out much cheaper, because you might not need to do these big trials, because you could use data as the comparison, you know, as the placebo, if you have all of these data out there for certain therapies at least.
Is there room then for the state to step in and say that data should be shared, and to actually say this is a definition of what data should be shared and let's make sure that it gets out there? Is there room for that?
I'm not sure if it's the state, but this, for example, could be something that the media could be picking up, you know, to rather think, do something good, guys, share the right data.
The payers, there is a need for libertarian paternalism. We need at some point to have guidance. Governments or payers and providers need to help people. Behavioral science is a good example to adopt spontaneously the behaviors that are good for themselves and for the community.
Well, this seems like an appropriate place for policymakers to say, look, the data stripped of its identifying information needs to be available, and I think in large cases that is.
But that's a problem, because
it's not a problem
you can't revisit data that is fully anonymized. First, we can't promise that data can be fully anonymized, but say that your algorithms are better 5 years after, you want to revisit 10 years of data and identify certain cohorts. And if you don't have a way to de-anonymize, then progress is useless. And
you'd have to use technology by assigning a number that gets cryptoed and can run back. So I think the answer is tech. But it's clear that consumers need to ultimately be able to protect their privacy. I mean, you may think that you don't need to have the privacy. A lot of people do for all kinds of reasons. There's discrimination in the employment place. There's other kinds of discrimination, and privacy issues are important to people, fundamental to their liberty. The other issues, though, there's going to be a lot of additional kind of data available, from biometrics on people to what they eat to their genetics to everything, and that is going to be a huge source of information, both for the good of humanity, analyzing that data and figuring out what works in terms of behaviors and the relationship to genetics, but also it's a big privacy issue, obviously.
I don't know where you get that I don't want privacy. I want everyone to have privacy, and actually my company does not sell its data. And we have a double process for people to agree and opt in for sharing it. I just say that at some point, if a government pays to provide healthcare to people, the government is morally allowed to ask people to share their data in return, for people to give. It's not only about getting. It's not, to use or to paraphrase someone, it's not just what I can do for you, but also what you can do for the
Yeah,
system.
I think we agree, but the solution is tech, of course.
But the question,
Inclusive tech.
but the question
Inclusive
for
tech.
me is, I mean, why are people, and this is a general question, are freaking out when you ask them for data and then they share literally everything on Facebook? Everything, and you cannot even delete that on Facebook. Rather than say, okay, I share some of my data and they will be anonymized and assume that, and they can actually do good for lots of others. I mean, sorry, my stupid behavior somewhere that I share on Facebook doesn't help anybody. It probably gets me in
Instant
trouble.
reward, because they get instant reward from likes. This is behavioral sciences. The reward that sharing your healthcare data, the reward is delayed,
so we
and our
have to
brains are
reward
favoring
it.
instant reward.
So we have to reward to give your data. that
Exactly,
actually
give and take.
I think it's also a little bit of a myth that we're all freaking out about sharing our data in health circumstances. Because in the UK, with the National Health Service, we're doing lots of pilots of that. We're also doing lots of citizen engagement with that. And there isn't genuinely a concern about sharing the data for the public good. But there's two issues. One, this data isn't this beautiful gold sitting there waiting to be just plucked away and used. It's really not usable in lots of different ways because it's not necessarily in the right format and it's not comparable across different sectors. So it's actually not as easy as let's have this beautiful data and suddenly we'll have all these health outcomes. But also, there's a lot to be put in place before we can legally and practically share this data. And lots of citizens are expecting things, saying, well, yeah, of course you do that. Why haven't you done it already? So I think it's almost, it's not almost true that people are saying, how dare you sort of sell my data for the public good. I think people
I think
feel
sometimes
that
they
that's
not even
possible.
ask. They not even ask. I
Well-
think it's that a lot of people don't know what they could contribute.
That's what citizens' engagement is all about.
And to your point, interoperability is a key issue, that the data is not standing there. In the US only, the estimate is 1,100 different standards for coding healthcare data. 1,100. Meaning that literally you can, in the same city, you can have an MRI in one hospital and then get an appointment in another hospital from the same payer provider. And if they use a different MRI, then they cannot just compare them without having some complex conversion when it can happen. And that's just one tiny example. It's one of the biggest issues. Yet, back to your point on, it's a myth that people don't want to share. The facts are there. People are sharing a lot more on social media than they are sharing with their governments willingly.
We're really coming up to the end now. There's time. I just want to ask you all one question, and that is, what is the real worry that keeps you up at night in the space of health ethics? Or, flip it round, what is the one hope that you see? What is the one bright light that you see happening where change is actually happening?
I think more on the bright light. I think honestly, when you look at health, at technology and new things coming like CRISPR, gene editing, all of these things. I mean, this is tricky in a way, but I think, and targeted therapies that you see starting up everywhere, not only in cancer, I think this is things where we can really, really make a huge impact. And when you look at the last 100 years, you know, what happened in healthcare, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, in the First World War, people were dying because they had an infected finger or, you know, an infected leg.
I'd say sort of as a relationship to wellness issue, I think there's a revolution going on in food, our food supply and the food chains, and namely handheld sensors that will be on every phone where people will scan the barcode and find out the nutrition value and get alternatives offered if it's a bad food choice. They'll also be able to scanners are now available for spectrometry where you can scan with light, get a feedback boost, figure out what the content is of that food. If it's fish, it's freshness, whether it's the food that's being marketed, whether it has hostile toxic ingredients inside. And that's going to affect the food chain all the way down back to the farm from the consumer with from thousands of data points to millions and billions of data points. And that'll affect health for the positive.
Food. Hilary.
I'll go for this wellness industry idea. The fact that we're technologizing and medicalizing our every breath and thought and things like the sleep app that tells you you've only slept 17% of the amount of quality sleep that you're supposed, that is going to keep you awake the next night and the next week. I had that for about 2 weeks, and then I dumped it because it was more stressful to know the quality of sleep that I didn't have and made me have less sleep the night after. So there's all this sort of tech, you know, that is becoming an industry rather than something that really we can just own ourselves.
And Olivier, tech, the last word for you.
The true ethics would be for governments and public policy to be data-driven, to be fact-driven, to be evidence-informed driven, meaning that governments need to employ behavioral and brain sciences in order to run randomized controlled trials, test things before they implement them. And by the way, surveys, questionnaires, focus groups, and any self-report method is not valid research, unlike most public and private organizations think, because still, unfortunately, strategies are mainly decided on this. The ethics should be to respect people and to use validated methods in order to make informed choices.
Thank you very much indeed. Closing words there. I'd like you all to join me with a big round of applause, please.
Thank you very much. And
Thank
thank you,
you for
Piers.
staying.
Thank you, Piers.
And I'm sure this conversation is going to continue on in the coulisses.
Thank you.